रंग चढ़े खुद का ही खुद पे बच्चों को तू ऐसे बढ़ा। बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना।
रोशन हो ये नन्हे दिए इन्हें तू रोज सजा। बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना।
जादू है ये जीने दे जरा। बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना।
गिरने दे बढ़ने दे उनको पास आए तो गले भी लगा।
बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना।
नई ये दुनिया नया आसमां।
बच्चों को बचपन से ही सिखा।
खेलते खेलते साथ निभा।
ऐसे तो उनका जीवन सजा।
ये बचपन है त्योहार हर दिन का। ये पहचान ले और रोज मना। बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना। बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना। बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना। अरे अब तो मना ले यारा।
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Bachpan Manao Masterclass. I'm Radhika, Research Manager at Step Foundation, and I'll be hosting the Masterclass today. This is part of a series of Masterclasses that will bring to you expert voices, voices of research. Research as a public good is a significant pillar of Bachpan Manao. And through that, we bring to you cutting-edge research live, whether it is brain research, cultural practices on the ground, or psychographies of the mind, so that these become available for you in your respective areas of work and intervention. A bit about Bachpan Manao. Bachpan Manao is an initiative of ICSTEP, a non-for-profit foundation, co-founded by Nandan and Rohini Nilakani and Shankar Maruvada, at the heart of which is people-centric transformation at societal scale. Bachpan Manao is a 100+ organization mission to celebrate and recognize the abundance of childhood for the 0 to 8-year-olds in India. In this context, very happy to bring to you the talk about parenting, because joyful childhood, celebrating childhood has to come with joyful parenting. And I am very thrilled to bring to you Dr. Jodi Pawluski, PhD, a distinguished neuroscientist, therapist, and author based at the University of Rennes in France. And she's going to be talking to us about the mom brain, the neuroscience of parenting and perinatal mental health. Welcome, Dr. Pawluski. A bit about the session today. Dr. Pawluski will explore the key transformations in the brain during the transition to parenthood and what this means for parenting. She will explore questions like, what are brain changes that happen during pregnancy and the postpartum in both mothers and fathers? How does this impact perinatal mental illness? Through this, one can learn how to create supportive interventions that foster resilience in parents, benefiting both parent and child. A little more about Dr. Jodi Pawluski. She's recognized for her work on neuroscience of motherhood, mom brain, and perinatal mental health. She has published in top-tier scientific journals such as JAMA Neurology, Trends in Neuroscience, and Nature Mental Health. Her work has been highlighted by major media, the New York Times, Scientific American, the Boston Globe, and Elle. Dr. Pawluski is the author of Mommy Brain and the host of a podcast, Mommy Brain Revisited. That's a lovely podcast. I will share the link on chat and subsequent to the masterclass. You should explore that for her conversations with various neuroscientists and researchers talking about parenting brain, both of moms and fathers. Very, very excited to welcome Dr. Jodi Pawluski. She's a neuroscientist, but one of the most fun and exciting neuroscientists I've had conversations with. And over to you, Dr. Jodi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here and to share some of the science with you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I also love that the video you showed is just really encapsulate our goal, right? To have healthy, joyful children and also positive interactions with parents. Maybe not all the time. It's not normal to be happy and content all the time, but at least most of the time. So I'm going to just hop on and share my slides. Just 1 second. Let's see. I have to move you over. Always becomes a bit. And here we go. Let's see if this is going to. There. This should work. You can see my slides.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yes, so as Radhika said, I'm going to be talking about not just brain changes with motherhood, but also brain changes in all parents, looking at motherhood, fatherhood, and how the brain changes might be associated with perinatal mental illness, such as postpartum depression. And to make it maybe more interactive, I thought, and exciting for me and for you, I'm going to start off with a question here. Hopefully you can see it. There we go. Do you think the brain changes in fathers? Because I think we talk a lot about how the brain changes with mothers, but what do you think of brain changes in fathers? So feel free to go to the Slido and give a comment or in the chat. And I'll just give you a minute to jump in there.
There's a phenomenal number of yeses and one maybe.
Okay, good. So I'm already dealing with experts. That's great. So I'm going to be talking about some of the key points that happen in the brain of parents, human parents, highlighting some of the recent research looking at changes in structure and function. But before I get into that, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about me and how I came to this research area. And in fact, I've really been interested in the intersection between the brain, behavior, and hormones, and how these factors are interrelated. And really from a small child myself, I grew up on a small farm in Western Canada. I was always interested in how animals were behaving. So we would often have moms, hens and baby chicks in the summer and the springtime. And I would often be curious about how that's all working. How do they work? And I remember as a young child once asking my grandma, how does a chicken work? And she actually drew me a little picture of a chicken with the organs inside. And I wish I'd kept that picture, but that's really where I started with this fascination of how do we work as humans and as animals. And then going to university, it really became this interest in not just how we work, but how these specific physiological changes, hormones in particular, affect our brain and then affect our behavior. And what better time to actually look at this? What more fascinating time? I don't think there is a more fascinating time than to look at the interaction between these factors across pregnancy and into motherhood. So that's really where I've spent the majority of my research time, is really learning more about brain changes with motherhood. And I also want to say I am now a mother, but I was doing this research long before I had children, which perhaps informed my journey as a parent. But I still think that, you know, we should all be quite fascinated about how the brain is changing in mothers as well as in fathers and all parents. Now, I've also, over the past few years, I've been speaking more and more about the brain changes with parenthood because I've realized from speaking, you know, with authors who have contacted me while they're writing books, that there's really this need to understand how the brain is changing. And Emma Jane Unsworth wrote this memoir of her struggles with postnatal depression. And she posted this quote on Instagram a few years ago. And I had a pleasure of speaking with her while she was writing her book. But she wrote about how maybe if I'd known there was a normal mental sea change coming, I wouldn't have been so blindsided and it might not have tipped over into postnatal depression. Maybe. And this has really been a driving force for me to share the science so that people understand that there really are normal changes in the brain across pregnancy and the postpartum period, which in many women, this can give relief to know that, oh yeah, my brain feels a little bit different, but it's just normal and it's changing. But of course, in others, there's really are, you know, significant mental illnesses that need to be addressed. But my hope is that in understanding how the brain is changing in healthy pregnancy and with parenting, this can just give us a bit of relief when we're not feeling quite as we think we should, but also just give us knowledge about the fascinating things that are happening in our brains as we become parents, or as, you know, others become parents and we get to watch them become parents. So this has really been a driving force for me. Now, I'm going to talk a bit or mostly probably about motherhood, but I'm also going to talk about fatherhood. So I thought I'd just bring up some key points because I think sometimes we forget how important mothers are in society. We often are focusing on how the child is developing, which is closely related to obviously to how mother is doing because she's often the primary caregiver. And we do know that 80% of human females will give birth. And so this is quite a significant percentage of the population. We know that this transition to motherhood, which we now talk about as matrescence, can have really a profound impact on a mother's life. It, you know, not only biologically, but also socially and psychologically. We also know when talking about the brain that often mothers will say, you know, that they feel their brain isn't working well during this time. And this is a quite common narrative, which is part of my book. And I don't have time to talk about it all here, but I will talk about it a bit. We also know that this time, you know, this transition to parenthood is a time when a number of women will struggle with mental illness, but also a number of fathers, up to 10% of fathers will struggle with depression or clinical levels of anxiety during this time. And as I'll talk about, I'm going to talk about all the fascinating changes in the brain with this transition to parenthood, or at least not all of them, but I'm going to highlight some key points. And now I put this ad up on the side. This is an advertisement for a clothing company, Anne Klein. I actually found this on in a magazine on a long haul flight. And I thought that this is also really important as a take home, is that every human being is born out of the body of a woman. And yet we just don't know so much about women as they become parents. And so I'm going to share with you what we know about the brain because the research is changing, thankfully. So let's start with what mothers often talk about, and that is that, you know, this is a meme from the internet, but there's many different ones. This idea that I used to have functioning brain cells, but I traded them in for children. And in fact, I mean, if you look at this woman who has 2 children that seem quite healthy and functional, I would hope you would all realize, or at least think that this isn't really true, that she's changed in her brain cells because she's been able to keep the children alive and healthy. So that takes a lot of brain power. But of course, this isn't really how moms often feel. They often feel their brain isn't functioning as it should. They're more forgetful and things like this. And so there is this idea that the brain is not as it should be with motherhood. And so I have a question for you here is whether or not you felt or heard others talk about memory changes during pregnancy or early motherhood. And is this common or something you've heard about?
Yeah, people are responding
Yeah,
with a yes in chat.
yeah. So
There's a
what I
no
can
too. There's one no.
One note. Yeah, I mean, it varies for different individuals, and this is an area of research that I'm still exploring. But what I can tell you, and this is actually where I started my doctoral research, is looking at in rodents, in rat mums. I was looking at the interaction between hormone levels in the postpartum period, experience mothering, as well as memory changes and brain changes, looking at the hippocampus, which is an area important for memory. And what was interesting about our research in the animal models was that we found that first-time mother rats, they did have fewer new neurons being produced, but they also had better learning and memory. And in fact, there's been, although a small body of literature, it needs to grow more, but there is research showing that there are many positive cognitive and memory outcomes in parents. So better memory for faces, memory for the touch of their infant. There's memory, can recognize the smell of their own infant within hours of giving birth. And so there's a lot of enhancements. But on the other side, in human mothers, there's also been, although not consistent, but there's been some recognition that there are some slight deficits in short-term working memory or memory for words. But on the flip side, there's also been research showing there's better memory for parenting related items in pregnant women, as well as better attention in pregnant women, or postpartum women, I should say. So there's kind of this mix, but many women will say they feel their memory's not working well, but if they're brought into the lab and given a memory test, they often will do well. However, I think we need to look at what's going on in the home that's really making them feel that their memory isn't working, because I have a feeling it has to do with all the things a mother typically has to carry out in her day, and that can really impact how much her brain is able to do. Now, I'm not going to delve into this anymore. I just want you all to know that we don't trade in our neurons for children if we're mothers, but we definitely can feel the impact of perhaps doing too much, and that can impact how our brain is working. And I'm happy to discuss this further. But let's delve into really those brain changes that we're starting to see in the research over the past few years. And I'm going to be talking about brain changes in the structure, so like the size and the volume of different brain areas, and then the function, which is the activity. So with structure, and this is in the human research, we're usually talking about gray matter volumes. And the function, we're usually talking about blood flow, and there's some research also on what we would call brain waves. But I'll be talking about both of these just to clarify some points and give you some of the key findings. So I'm going to start first with pregnancy and postpartum in women. And one of the first studies looking at structure was this study in 2002. And actually, since this was the first one, and then it was almost how many years? 15 years later, when there was another study published looking at structural changes. But you can see in this study, which is nice, is across the timeline of pregnancy, so from the -40 to the 0 weeks in that figure, that there seems to be an overall decrease in the size of the brain, and this is the whole brain and the size of the ventricles. And then in this study, they showed that it increased back to preconception size in the postpartum period. And this was really the first study. It was done only in a few participants, but it showed that there's this global change in the brain, which is really interesting to think about. Now, I also want to point out, because you might think, oh, your brain's shrinking, your memory's worse. That makes sense. Actually, there's been no research linking any of the structural changes with any of the memory changes to date. So we definitely don't have a link yet. But what's more interesting is recent research that's come out of Elsalina Hugzima's lab and Susanna Carmona's lab, is they've been really detailing where these changes occur in the brain and if they are related to memory, stress, parenting, sleep deprivation, mode of delivery, and so forth. So this is a summary of their first study, and I want to highlight that the images there are first-time mothers. They're looking at increase in structure. This is from prior to pregnancy to the postpartum period, or they're looking at decreases in certain brain areas. And you can see that there's no increases, but there are some decreases. And this has been replicated. This is a pretty consistent finding that's happened in different populations in different countries. So it seems to be part of that normal change of pregnancy where there's these decreases in structural volume of certain brain areas. So the decreases I want to point out are not catastrophic, or you're not losing half your brain if you become a mom. It's about 1% decrease, and in this research they've really showed that these decreases are in brain areas that are important for social behavior, so important for understanding the needs of others, which is something that's very important for parenting, right? Because when we have that baby in front of us, although we don't know immediately what they need, hopefully with experience and time we can kind of figure out why they're crying or what they're reaching for as they're growing. So this is this idea of this is part of these brain areas that are really important for understanding and trying to understand the needs of others. What I also want to point out is they found, and again, this is very consistent, that these brain changes, this extent of this decrease in gray matter volumes, occurs in almost all mothers that are pregnant. So it's very consistent. I think of this as if you see a woman and she's pregnant, most pregnant women, you can very clearly see that they're pregnant when it's close to the time of birth because of the shape of their uterus, right? And so for me, I think of the brain, it's also changing shape. It's kind of very consistent, these changes. And so it's healthy, it's normative. And this research has also shown that these brain changes that are, highly consistent in these areas of the brain important for social behaviors are not related to, as I mentioned, birth, stress, sleep, or memory, at least at the scale they were investigating and at the time points they were looking at. So, I mean, this is all, as a neuroscientist, I think, oh, well, that's pretty cool. The brain is changing. It's changing a lot, actually, in 9 months. And this is in an adult. It's like very cool. But then actually, probably the more important thing is, what does this mean? And does it mean anything? And so what's really important, I think, for us to think about is that these brain changes, and the research has shown, is that this reduction in brain size is actually associated with a positive feeling towards your child. So the mothers in this study, the ones that had almost all of them had this decrease in size, but this was associated, the amount of decrease was associated with an increase in how she felt towards her child. So this is, I like to think of it like dynamite comes in small packages, right? The brain is becoming more efficient. It's becoming fine-tuned. It's becoming, this piece of, this organ that's functioning and very fine-tuned into and prepared to learn how to parent. And so I think that, we often think that less is a worse thing, but I want us to think that these structural changes are healthy, they're normal, and they're actually a good thing for pregnant women to experience. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, but I also want us to remember that these brain changes are healthy and normal, but of course they need a healthy environment for them to take place. And so often there's increased stress during this time, or a lot of pressure during this time, or isolation. And that's not healthy, of course, for anyone, but it also isn't healthy for a pregnant woman as she's becoming a parent. So her brain is going to change in really healthy ways, but it also has to have a healthy environment to do this. So, and then you might think, well, okay, it's 1% change. Is it really a big deal? And so this was a great study that came out comparing moms, first-time mothers, and then these are again structural changes, aspects of structure of the brain, so different measurements of structure. So they looked at cortical volume, surface area, and in the image below, there's some of the highlights there. And so they were looking at first-time mothers during matrescence, we like to call this now, this kind of stage of development for those who become parents, versus what happens with these same brain measurements in adolescent girls and compared to adult females who never had children. And so you can see the graph where there's the red dot for the adolescent girl, the blue dot for the moms, and the green dot for the adult females. And at each point, there's a different measurement of the structure of the brain. And what you can see is the adolescent females have very similar changes as the mothers. And so we often accept adolescence as being a time, it's also many years, so a time over these years of a lot of change socially, biologically, neurobiologically. This, we all accept this as a very significant time of change. And what this study, I think, starts to prove to us is that across pregnancy and the postpartum period, that those brain changes in mothers is also really significant and important to consider. And I think that this is a great way moving forward to really embrace the research in this area because of the importance and the significance of these brain changes in adulthood in a short period of time. So the brain changes happen with mothers, they're consistent, they're important for parenting, and they're quite significant in terms of what you'd see at other stages in life and brain changes. So just to summarize this part up briefly is that the brains of mothers change significantly in structure, and this is a good thing. And these changes are related to positive feelings of parenting. But let's move on to brain function, because brain function, for me, structure is, it's interesting, but then function is actually what the brain is doing, right? So how is it actually responding? How is it being activated? What is it being activated to? And so for these studies in parents, what often happens is they're comparing a parent and a non-parent, and they'll be looking at a picture of an infant, and they'll look to see how, oops, I have some things on the screen, but they'll look to see how the brain is activated in response to looking at a baby's picture or listening to a baby cry. Or they'll take parents, mothers and fathers, and they'll give them a picture of their own infant versus the picture of another infant, and then look at how their brain is responding. And so I put a picture up here of my firstborn, now almost 13 years ago. And I think she's adorable, of course. Hopefully you do too. But I can tell you that my brain is definitely functioning more as I look at this cute little face, and it's being more activated than your brain is. But if you put perhaps your child up or your niece or nephew up, you would probably have more function potentially, especially if you're a parent or spend a lot of time with them, than me. So this is one way the research has really been investigating brain areas that are important for parenting and ones that become activated in response to a cue from a baby. So I'll just say goodbye to her for now. They do grow up fast, though. And I want to move on to really, this is a nice review of all the brain areas that are activated and function differently in parents. And this review was done a number of years ago. And the field has continually grown in investigating how the brain is activated and when and other aspects of it. But I think this gives you a nice overview of the number of different brain areas involved, and in fact, the functions of these different brain areas. So I'm going to just briefly walk through this. This is in the schematic, they have the amygdala and the hypothalamus of two key brain areas that they talk about as the hub of the parental brain. And then I've written out some of the core behaviors, for example, and they've schematically colored them in and different brain areas that are important. But I think what's important is we know that the brain functions differently in areas that are important for motivation and reward. You want to be motivated to care for your child and find them rewarding. So you're definitely going to see modification in those neurocircuits. Empathy is another big one. So this is being able to empathize with pain or emotional distress of others. There's also this perception action piece where you need to be able to perceive what's happening, figure out what's happening, and then act appropriately. Then you're going to have those neural circuits, as I mentioned, that are understanding the needs of others. So this mentalizing piece. And then those circuits that are important for emotion regulation. So being able to regulate yourself, make decisions, organize responses. And this is also really important. So really what I'm pointing out here is that there's a number of different neurocircuits that we use every day, regardless of whether or not we're parents. But when we become a parent, or when a person becomes a parent, there's this increased functionality or increased response in these brain areas in response to the infant. And they really have to be coordinated and work together, to kind of elicit the parenting responses to the infant. And this is something, I think, we're not reinventing or developing a new brain in a parent, but what we're doing is using circuits that are already there in a slightly different way. And this is part of learning how to parent. Parenting isn't something that's automatic. It's not something that comes naturally or as instinctually as we think. It's a lot of mistakes and learning from those mistakes. And your brain is figuring out how to do this. And so these are, you can see that many areas in the brain are responsible for learning how to parent. Now, I also want to point out that research has shown that increased brain activity in response to infant cues is linked to stronger bonding and heightened sensitivity towards the infants. And this has particularly been done in mothers, but there's been research in fathers definitely showing increased brain activity is related to more synchrony and between the father and child. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So again, we're seeing these structural changes are healthy for positive aspects of parenting. The changes in brain activity are healthy for parenting as well. And then one big question I often get is, why do these brain changes happen? Is it hormones? We all assume it's always hormones because, of course, hormones are incredibly important for maintenance of pregnancy. And in animal models, for the past probably 40 years, we've been doing research looking at how the brain changes with motherhood and how this is linked to neurotransmitters and hormones and other neurochemicals. But it's only been as of maybe 2023, I think, where there is finally a study that linked hormones, progesterone in that case, or estradiol, I should say, in that case, and some of the structural brain changes. So yes, these brain changes are related to hormones. So we can think about that as, a mechanism for these changes. But as I will talk to you in a bit, they are also related to experience parenting, especially those functional changes. So the structural changes seem to be more driven by these hormonal changes. This is the idea, but the functional changes, as I'm going to show you, is really has to do with interacting with the child. So that brings me to fatherhood. And, you know, we can think of these brain changes as probably also happening in adoptive parents, although there hasn't been much research in this. And I'll just focus here on what we know about fathers. This research is growing. And I will say, when I first started hearing this and seeing this research in the news to such a high degree, I was a bit disappointed, to be honest, because we hadn't spent enough time, I felt, studying how the brain changes with motherhood and letting moms, you know, for once have some priority in the research world. But since then, I've actually been convinced that sharing the story of fatherhood and how the brain changes with fatherhood is really important. It's really important for fathers to hear, but it's also important for mothers to hear, to realize that fathers have everything in their brains they need to parent. You don't have to be pregnant and give birth to parent, and to have brain changes that are important for this to happen. What you need is to spend time with your child. So I'm going to talk about here again those structural brain changes and some of those functional brain changes that I think are really important when we're talking about fatherhood. And I thought I'd also ask you, I mean, you seem like you all know that the father's brain also changes, but I think we need to be reminded that fathers play an important role in many species, in fact. And so this is the question: in which of the following species does the father play a dominant role? Emperor penguins, seahorses, swans. We can add in other species as well, because there's quite a few where the father does play a dominant role, or shares the role. And I think sometimes we forget that.
We have 4 owls and 1 seahorse.
Yes, so it is all.
More owl.
Yeah, yeah, and particularly in bird species, you see a lot of fathers playing a role, but we also see this in seahorses. We see this in some monkeys, some mice species. I mean, there's a lot of different species where you see a role for fathers. That's quite important. And in some of them, the fathers take on the full role, and for others it's just a shared role. And also humans, we know, we're alloparental species, so that means we usually share the parenting typically, and it's important that we know that, I think, and are reminded of that. So I've given a link to this talk in the notes that you'll get later, or not to this talk, I should say, to this article. But this is out of Darby Saxby's lab, and she does a lot of research on brain changes in fathers. And this was an interesting study she had come out where she showed, in fact, that when looking at the structure or the volume of fathers' brains, that there's a greater volume loss in fathers who spent more time with their infants, who took more pleasure in interacting with their infants, and who experienced less parenting stress. And so, of course, this volume loss, this shrinkage, this decrease in structure in a father's brain from pregnancy to the postpartum period isn't to the same degree as what we're seeing in mothers, and it's not in all those same locations. Of course, they don't have all those physiological changes either. But what's important, I think, to point out is that, yes, a father's brain also shrinks, that this is also associated with positive interactions with their infant. So again, there's this fine-tuning of the brain. And again, in fathers, I put up this same image that we had before, because in fact, this is a global human parental caregiving neural network. So these brain areas are important not only in mothers, but also in fathers when we're thinking about function of the brain in parents. And I mean, although they might be activated in slightly different ways, there's research showing that, you know, different neurotransmitters might be involved in slightly different ways. And also that experience is an important feature when we're talking about the function and the structure in a father's brain, although it's been less studied in a mother's brain. But you can see that there is this global, you know, neural network that's important for parenting. So a lot of different brain areas have to work together to elicit caregiving responses. But I want to go back to experience for a bit and highlight this one study that I think is really important because, yes, the brain changes in mothers. This seems like a given. And yes, I've shown that it changes in fathers. But I think what's really important, again, and I know I've said this a couple times, but experience matters. This interaction with the child matters. So this study looked at mothers and fathers who were the primary caregivers, and then they compared the brain functional changes to fathers that were secondary caregivers. So I've just put up one slide here because, I mean, I don't know about you, but I like to look at some brain images periodically. And you can see it's quite colorful. But I want to draw your attention, and oh, maybe I will get the pointer up here. So here this is where the amygdala is in the human brain. So they're showing a lot of activity here. And what's important is going over to these bar graphs, particularly this one. So the pink is the primary caregiver mother. The light green is the primary caregiver father. And this is the secondary caregiver father. And this is in response to a video of their child at about 2 years. So, and this is the amygdala, and this is the amygdala. This is an activity response. So what you can see here is the primary caregiving mother and father have very similar amygdala activation compared to the secondary caregiver father. So you can see we would, you know, assume that then the time caregiving is important for this amygdala response. We also can see now this is a different brain area that's not a hub of the parental brain neurocircuitry, but you can see a sex difference where the fathers do have a difference in the superior temporal sulcus compared to the mothers. And this isn't a surprise because, of course, you know, males and females are different. But what's more exciting to me is this data in the amygdala, where you can see that it's not whether you've given birth that's important. It's actually the amount of time you're spending with the child that's important for some of these brain responses. Now, I want to also preface this with saying, of course, the secondary caregiver parent, in this case, the father, it's not like he can't parent. And it's just, you know, he doesn't have the same expertise as a parent that spends more time with their child. At least this is how I would interpret this data. But I think what's really important, and I'm just highlighting it here again, is that experience parenting, interacting with the child, it's what's really important for shaping the parental brain, particularly in the postpartum period. And this is, I think, something that's very exciting to think about because you know then that it's about interaction, it's about being with your child, it's about making mistakes and learning from them. And this is all part of parenting, and this helps you develop a parental neural network in your brain. Another really interesting piece about fatherhood and some of the brain changes in the research that's coming out is that their belief about their role is important and impacts how their brain is functioning. So in fathers, their belief in the importance of their involvement in child rearing also plays a role in how their brain is being activated in response to their child. And I think this is a fascinating piece. I'm excited to hear more about this research. I spoke with the researcher Pascal Vertichka in episode 43 of my podcast, so you can delve into it a bit more there. So just to sum up this section, I'm leaving you with this quote, that the parental brain is primarily built through caring for offspring. And this involves mismatch and reparation, that's making mistakes, repairing the mistakes, learning right? That's what this is about. And it's not unique to birthing parents. It also overlaps with brain areas we use in other social relationships. So we're not rebuilding the brain, but we're connecting it in a different way where it's focused on learning how to care for the infant, which makes sense because you want your child to survive. That's the goal. But of course, this is one piece of the puzzle. Back in the introduction, I talked about how about 20% of women will struggle with mental illness during the postpartum period, but also during pregnancy. And we know that 10% of fathers will also struggle. So for me, when I think of mental illness, I'm thinking the brain. Something is changing in the brain. Of course, this is likely in response to perhaps genetics, biology, but also environment, social factors. There's a lot of different factors that can make us feel mentally unwell. And this is where I spend a lot of my research time in investigating this. And as I said, we know that 20% will struggle with mental illness. This is mothers, 10% of fathers. We know that suicide is a leading cause of death in mothers in pregnancy and the postpartum period, and quite a few countries that have studied this to date. So Canada, United States, France, the UK, and others have shown that suicide is a leading cause of death. This is really significant. And I think that we really need to develop better interventions and treatments to support mothers and parents in this transition as they're, becoming parents. We need more options to maintain mental health during this time. Now, in 2017, I wrote this review, which you also have access to. I sent the link along, and really summarizing the research about how the brain changes in the postpartum period in women who have anxiety and depression. And as I mentioned, and I've said it a few times now, about 20% of women will struggle with some level of anxiety and depression. And when we did this review, there was actually probably about 25 research papers done on this, which is not very many. So if you think of 80% of women will become pregnant, 20% of them will struggle with a mental illness, and we only have done 20 studies in women, this is actually, should be a bit shocking compared to the thousands that are out looking at the neurobiology of depression in men, for example. So this has been really a neglected area of research. But since 2017, and we wrote this review, the research field has been growing to really understand the brain changes in pregnancy and postpartum period that are associated with clinical levels of anxiety or depression. So I'm hoping, in a few more years, we're going to have a better picture. But I thought I'd give you a few take homes from the research to date. So first of all, one thing that is really important is that there are similar brain areas involved in postpartum mental illness as in these mental illnesses at other times of life, but they seem to function in a different way. And this is a picture from our review where we did a kind of a schematic here. The pinks are, brain areas important or playing a role in postpartum depression or associated with depression in the postpartum period. And then the greens and yellows are some key brain areas associated with major depressive disorder or general anxiety. And I will also say at this time when we did this review, and I even think to date, there aren't any studies looking specifically at the brain changes associated with postpartum anxiety. So we still have a ways to go to learn more about that and how it is associated with the brain changes. But you can see there's some similarities in how in those brain areas that are important in depression in the postpartum period, as well as at other times of life, but there's also some differences. And so this actually led us to really talk about this uniqueness of the neurobiology of perinatal mental illness. So, and that's something that's really important if we want to develop interventions and treatments to improve mental health in parents. Now, what's another important piece, which I hope is obvious to you, is that many of these brain areas that are impacted or play a role in postpartum depression are also brain areas that are important for parenting. And so this makes sense then when a person is struggling, a new parent is struggling with their mental health, that they're also most likely struggling with parenting. So there's this overlap. But for me, that also signals that there's an urgency to really support parents, mothers in particular, in their parenting journey, because we don't want them to feel ill. It's not great for them, and it's definitely not good for their children. So just to summarize this piece is that perinatal mental illness most likely is characterized by distinct neurobiology, which means we need distinct interventions and distinct treatments. And I'm really excited to see where the research goes with this. I think we have much to learn, but we're starting to piece things together. And once we learn more about the neurobiology of perinatal mental illness, then everyone will benefit. So then my final question is really, how can we unburden the maternal mind? A lot of these, there's a lot of pressure when we become mothers to be and do certain things, there's a lot of pressure to not be too stressed and, because it will impact your child. And, there's a lot going on and a lot of pressure. And the question I often think about is, how can we alleviate that pressure for mothers, but also for fathers? So I wanted to leave this question with you and ask you whether or not there are common practices in your community to support new parents. And, I think this is where we really need to start, is we have to start to have options for parents within our communities and to support new parents as best we can. So with that, I just will say thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'm happy to discuss further.
That was lovely. Thank you, Dr. Jodi.
Thanks.
I think very interesting and exciting possibilities that you've put out. Just couple of things that struck me. You dwelt on it in the presentation, but key highlights for me, one was to think about the maternal brain as not so much an increase or decrease, but a refinement, a pruning that seems to also happen in childhood, right? When children are growing, there is the pruning for something to actually be more productive and effective towards a need, right? So I think that shift, I think, is very, very significant, not to take away what women experience, but I think that is something that I took away.
Yes. Yeah. I thank you for highlighting that. Because for me, I think we have such a negative stereotype often of the female brain and the maternal brain, that it's gone to mush, it can't do anything. Because, I think women are just given too much to do. But in fact, the brain's doing amazing things, and it's becoming honed in, fine-tuned. And I think that this shift in how we think about it is really important.
Yeah, thanks. Another point was to think parenting, right? So as you were talking of both the father's brain and you indicative adoptive parents, is it about behaviors and actions that reinforce certain parenting skills? No, it's not merely a hormonal change. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a hormonal change. And then the question is, what is it, right? So it's time they spend with the child, but then what kind of time? So this is a question I think about. In some of the research, they did show a positive correlation between some of the brain changes and the synchrony between the child and the parent, the behavioral synchrony, the attunement, how well they kind of interacted together. So it seems that it has to do with not necessarily quantity of time, but quality of time to some degree. But I also imagine some of those brain changes, the more time you spend with your child or with your child or children, you're attuned to different needs and things, right? So time plays a role, but I would love to see this kind of pieced out a bit differently. And hopefully we'll learn more from the research soon, but to really get at what is it, like quality, quantity, is it skin to skin? Is it, playing? Is it just being together? Is it just positive interactions? Is it just yeah, what are those different pieces? And we definitely don't have that yet, but hopefully that's the direction. I mean, some research is starting to go that way, looking at parents' stress level and then how that can affect their brain when they're interacting with their child. But we definitely need more pieces to that puzzle. But I do think bottom line is experience with your child is really important, interacting with them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just inviting others, if they have questions or any comments, please do share, unmute yourself, or please share in the chat. I can ask on your behalf. While we wait, I think the other fascinating thing is, I think to shine the light on women's mental health, right? The period after giving birth. And I think this, it resonated with something else that a pediatrician was telling us, that when the mother and child go out of the hospital, uh, we give a lot of information about the child, right? But do we tell anything to the mother about herself, right? And what that life looks like. And actually, they asked Hita that question, one of the doctors, while we were having a chat. And
You don't get any I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's quite typical that moms don't get any information. They don't even get asked about how they're feeling. Or if they say something about how they're feeling that could be maybe a bit negative, then they're often just been like, oh, but your baby's healthy, you should be happy. Like everything will be fine, right? I know though, I've saw this recently in parts of the United States, they are sending home a book with moms. It's called Good Moms Have Scary Thoughts. It's a great book by Karen Kleiman, which has a cartoon on one side and then a little bit of text on the other side, that has been really focused on, those thoughts that many parents will have, especially mothers, that can be very scary, but also are quite normal. And so there are these, in some places, actions to send moms home with something. Someone also told me moms in their pregnancy in somewhere in Canada get like literally a textbook about all the information about what's going on for them and their child, but no one's going to read a textbook when they're pregnant or postpartum. Like, what are you thinking?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
there are two comments, questions in the chat. I'll just read all of them. There are multiple thank yous. One question is there any research showing how a support system affects mental health in parents and their relationship with their kids?
yes, so this has been an interesting piece of research that I often think about, because we're like, oh, support, you have support, why aren't you feeling better? Oh, I have lots of support, but why I'm not feeling better? In fact, the research shows it's perceived social support that's important. So it's not just that someone's coming over and helping, it's that perception that it is helpful. And so there is definitely an important role of social support and getting out and not being isolated. So we need to be around others. But where we start to see some of those, at least some brain changes, are when the mother perceives that the social support was helpful. And I think this is the piece that's often missing for moms and for everyone, because they're like, what do you mean? But I was helping you. But actually, it wasn't helpful because I had to tell you like the 20,000 things you were supposed to do, or you were just in the house, you didn't do anything. Like that wasn't really what, you know what I mean? Like I'm thinking of this going, these are the narratives that go on in some people's heads. Whereas when you have someone come in and actually do their thing, and it is helpful, this is different. So there's that disconnect. So we need to make sure that the social support is something that she feels is helping her.
Thanks, Swati Sidhu, for that question. There's one lovely comment from Pallavi Kumari saying this session was very informative.
Thank you.
She says, my life is also going in transition mode, and this session will really help me.
Oh, good. That's great to hear.
Okay, two more questions. One is, how important is family and community contribution for child development? From Mukul. And I'm going to ask the other question from Saida Gilani, who says, just a bit curious to know, are there changes in brain of mothers are equally similar to changes during adolescence?
Okay, so I'll start with the first one. Are the changes in mothers the same as what you see in adolescents? Yeah, so what I showed was just in terms of some of those structural components, we're seeing similarities, but there has been no other research showing or investigating that question specifically. I would anticipate some similarities in the changes, but also quite a few differences. Adolescence is coupled with different social interactions, different hormone changes, but definitely I think the take home from this is that the magnitude of the changes in the maternal brain can be in some cases at the same level of what we're seeing in adolescence. So for me, that makes me think that we should all then, think that this is an important period in a woman's life, and that we should all be, willing to provide options to support her better and support her brain health. So, and the second question is, yes, the role of the family and in child development, definitely. Yeah, in the community. So this is really important, of course. As I mentioned, we are an alloparental species. We're not meant to parent alone. Very few animals and species are. And so, of course, there's, having interaction with more adults as a child can be really beneficial. It also can take some of the pressure off the parents. And so these communities and families can play an important role. But again, it also needs to be tailored to the situation, right? It's like the social support, perceived social support is important. Healthy interactions are important. So
we are a bit over time, so we'll take the last question, which is, does the brain change differently with age and parenting experience? This is a question from Aditi Mekhovan.
Yeah, so this is another great question. I don't think we've studied yet specifically if the brain of younger mothers is different than the brain of older mothers at the time of birth, for example. But what I can tell you is we do know that once you parent, your brain will be impacted for the rest of your life, which makes sense, right? It's you will have a child and interact with them usually for many years ahead. So, and there's been research of parents in their 70s, particularly mothers, where you can see that their parenting experience has impacted the function of their brain. There's research done of women in their 50s to 80 years old, where you can tell if they've been pregnant based on images of their brain. There's research on parents in their 50s where their kids are a bit older, mothers and fathers, again, where the number of kids they have is related with some brain changes. And so these are kind of snippets, but I always like to think of, your child is developing and growing and it changing, and you're going to be developing and growing and changing with it. And that will be reflected in your brain. So some of those brain changes I talked about might look quite different when you have a teenager or a 25-year-old. Also, we know that the brain, there's one study looking at grandparents and the empathy network and how that actually is more activated when they interact with their grandchild than with their own child, right? So there's this element of parenting, caregiving, family that we're starting to tap into when we're thinking about brain changes. But I think there's always going to be that connection, but over time it will be modified based on the development of the child and the relationship. I don't know. It's fun to think about, right?
Yeah. Okay, that's a lovely teaser for the next session we're going to have with you about grandparents.
Okay.
With that, we'll end this masterclass. Thank you, Dr. Jodi Pawluski, for that great session. Thank you, everybody, for joining in and for the questions, for the participation, for the comments. We will see all of you very soon. I'll
Thank you
request
so
Dr.
much.
Jodi to just stay back.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
रंग चढ़े खुद का ही खुद पे बच्चों को तू ऐसे बढ़ा बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना
रोशन हो ये नन्हे दिए इन्हें तू रोज सजा बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना
जादू है ये जीने दे जरा बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना
गिरने दे बढ़ने दे उनको पास आए तो गले भी लगा
बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना
नई ये दुनिया नया आसमां
बच्चों को बचपन से ही सिखा
खेलते खेलते साथ निभा
ऐसे तो उनका जीवन सजा
ये बचपन है त्योहार हर दिन का ये पहचान ले और रोज मना बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना बचपन मना रे यारा बचपन मना अरे अब तो मना ले यारा